Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to our first workshop session of the 2021 Chisholm Annual Gathering. I'm Elise Berry, Associate for Advocacy and Leadership Development with the Council for Health and Human Service Ministries of the United Church of Christ. You are attending the workshop entitled, We Need a New Kind of Leadership, Equity Competent Leadership with Erica Merritt. Before I turn it over to Erica, I want to thank our partners at the Cornerstone Fund for sponsoring this session. And here is a word from the Cornerstone Fund.
At the United Church of Christ Cornerstone Fund, our mission is to join together in faith to invest in and build community.
Joining together.
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 In faith.
To invest in and build community.
Construir comunidades.
Community.
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 Thank you, Cornerstone Fund, for your ministry and for your support of this session. I am excited to be able to introduce Erica Merritt, founder of the Equius Group. I have gotten to know Erica in the past several months as Chisholm has worked with the Equius Group on a race, diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment of our organization. I am happy that she is here today to lead us in a workshop on equity competent leadership. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A and discussion. You are welcome to enter your comments and questions in the chat during the presentation, and then we will have an opportunity to talk more afterwards.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Merritt, and I am principal and founder with Equius Group. It's my pleasure to be with you for the annual gathering. Today, we will be talking about our need for a new kind of leadership, equity competent leadership. And we'll do that by defining equity competent leadership, by exploring the behaviors that undergird the concept, and finally, by talking about strategies for becoming a more equity competent leader. What does it mean to practice equity competent leadership? Practicing equity competent leadership means understanding dynamics of power and privilege and proactively embodying attitudes and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impact, and outcomes for all, while reinforcing and creating practices and policies that support that effort. When you hear me talk about leadership, I am thinking about leadership as behavior and not simply leadership in terms of position. So I'm thinking broadly about leadership, which means I'm absolutely talking about each and every one of you. So this is the model, and we will explore each one of these sections along the way, starting with ourselves and exploring this concept around what do we need to know and be aware of as it relates to our own identity. So when we think about privilege and oppression and how that lives within us and the reality that we can embody both privileges and oppressions at the same time, it's about awareness of our conscious and our unconscious internalized biases and how we actively work to address them. So the reflection questions for this section are, how will I cultivate my own self-awareness, and how will I translate that awareness into lasting behavior change? So when we talk about privilege, what do we mean? So often when we talk about privilege, people immediately think about being rich or having the kind of life where you don't have to worry about anything. First of all, I like to say that being human is challenging all on its own. We all have experiences that challenge us, whether we have wealth or not. But privilege is about more than whether or not you have money. It is about the social hierarchy that we were all born into. So we're talking about unearned social power that's accorded to us by both formal and informal institutions as a part of our society, and that all members of any dominant group have access to that privilege without having to do anything to earn it. It does not mean that one has not worked hard. It simply means that we live in a society that unfortunately values some groups of people over other groups of people, whether or not we believe that at an individual level. When we talk about oppression, we were talking about the reverse of privilege. We're talking about the systemic devaluing, the undermining, the marginalizing, and the disadvantaging of certain social identities against the privileged norm. So some people's value is denied, right? Is not valued in the same way, is not experienced in the same way. And so oppression can be felt, but not necessarily named, because unfortunately, people sometimes get so used to having that experience that it's almost difficult to peel it back and imagine how it isn't simply a part of your life. When we think about other, right, when we think about the other, I know sometimes we think about the other as, or the whole idea of othering, but here we're just thinking about what does it look like to be in a relationship with other people, right? To be connected to other people. And what do we need to know and understand about their identities, about the ways in which they hold privilege and the ways in which they embody oppression? To what extent are we able to engage in conversations about race and racism along with other isms? And do we have the capacity to interrupt biased behaviors when they occur both in us and in other people? So the question here is, how will I create and hold spaces for people to discover and develop their identities, relationships, and their capacity? Again, I mentioned that there's a social hierarchy. So you see here that this captures the different dimensions of diversity. It is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure immediately you can probably rattle off a few different dimensions that are not here, but we can't cover absolutely everything. These are 9 dimensions of diversity that always often come up in these conversations. And we see the corresponding value that society has placed on these different dimensions. So the up category would be the dominant category, and the down category would be the marginalized or the oppressed category. I want to make a distinction between how we might feel in terms of our own identity and what society tells us. So those two things may not be in alignment. So just because you may hold identities that are down or considered marginalized, that does not mean that that is the way you move through the world in terms of how you think about yourself. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I think about these groups as having differing power. I do not think of any of these groups as powerless, right? So whether you are in the up category or whether you are in the down category, you still have agency. And then finally, there's a you column. And in this moment, I want to encourage you to notice as you think through these different dimensions, where are the places that you are up? Where are the places that you hold privilege? Where are the places that you are down? Where are the places that you hold oppressed identities? What do you notice? What do you notice about your own experiences? And then finally, in the last column, you see the corresponding ism that goes with each one of these dimensions of diversity. So unfortunately, with this difference in value that we perceive around these different groups comes different forms of discrimination. And these are some of the examples that you see in that final row. So when we think about these different dimensions, we could push all of them through the framework that I'm about to share with you, which is called the 4 levels. But we're going to take one of them. We're simply going to take race, and we know that the corresponding form of discrimination is racism. And we're going to push that through this 4 levels framework, which is really helpful in understanding how these things are operating on different levels and how they are shaping our experiences based on those levels. And why does that matter? One of the reasons that matters, right, going back to being able to practice equity competent leadership, is because if you are going to intervene, if you are going to interrupt discrimination, you need to understand the ways in which it's operating on these different levels, because your intervention would be different for the interpersonal level than it would be for the internalized, or different for the institutional than it would be for the structural. So that's why you need to understand all 4 of these levels. So here we talk about this idea or this concept around internalized racism and the way in which, based on our racial identity, we internalize either inferiority or superiority. And you would have noticed that white was the power identity in that framework, and people of color were the marginalized identity in that framework. Here in this image, you see a young boy who was a part of a research study often called the doll study, that explored the way in which 3 to 7-year-old Black children in the 1940s were internalizing messages of white superiority. So the children were asked questions about the dolls that they were presented with, questions about the doll's character, questions about which dolls were smart, questions about which dolls were attractive. And over and over and over, these children showed a high preference for the white doll, even as Black children. And this was particularly concerning, because if they are having negative perceptions about the dolls that look like them, then what does that mean in terms of the way that they are thinking of themselves? Now, you might be thinking, Erica, that was the 1940s. Well, I can tell you, unfortunately, this research has been replicated and the results aren't very different. So even as recently as the 2010s, 11s, this research has been replicated and the results are the same. And in fact, they have looked at children from a variety of different backgrounds, and the messages around anti-Blackness are still pervasive, and the messages about white superiority are also continuing to be very prevalent. So that preference or that association between whiteness and intelligence, between whiteness and good character, and between whiteness and attractiveness still exists even today, unfortunately. So we have a lot of work to do. The work that you all need to do to become more competent leaders is essential for us building a more just and equitable future. When we think about being up, being in the power position, or being down, these are some of the corresponding behaviors that often folks are socialized into around their different identities. And of course, this gets complicated and is absolutely contextual based on the fact that we all hold identities that are up and identities that are down. So we are capable of exhibiting behaviors that fit into both of these categories, both the group that holds more power and the group that holds less power as well. When we think about interpersonal racism, we're talking about racism that occurs between individuals. This is the bias that occurs when people's internal beliefs become public in their interactions with other human beings. And frankly, This is the form of racism that people are most familiar with and most often comes to mind when we think about racism, right? Our measure for whether racism is happening is often whether or not people are nice to each other, right? How do people treat each other? If they are not calling each other names, or if they are not physically harming each other, if there are not racial microaggressions, then often we believe that racism can't be happening. But our understanding of racism is evolving. And we understand that not only does it occur at the internalized level and the interpersonal level, but it also happens at the institutional level, right? It happens within institutions and systems of power. And here we're talking about policies and practices that continue to produce racially inequitable outcomes, things that advantage white people and disadvantaged people of color. And there is a way that if you are in the dominant group, you take on that power that the institution has when you are the one who is enforcing those policies in an organization. Sometimes it's not that there are unfair policies on the books, if you will. The way that the policy is written may not be unfair, but the way that people are held to that policy within the organization may be where the unfairness comes in. So we know, for example, that often when it comes to discipline, right, even we can think about this in the context of schools, and we can think about this in the context of workplaces. So we know that as early as pre-K, that Black and brown children are disciplined, and we're talking suspensions, we're talking expulsions. Yes, I said pre-K. That happen to Black and brown children starting very, very early. And that follows them into elementary school, and then into middle school, and then into high school. And here we start to talk about the school to prison pipeline, right? The way in which juvenile justice is often interfacing with education. So let's say you don't end up in that system and you immediately go into the workplace, or you go into higher education and then ultimately into the workplace. Once there, it is not unusual for Black and brown people to face a higher level of scrutiny and be held to a different standard than their white counterparts, unfortunately, right? That discrimination continues. And where does that come from, right? What is the root of this institutional discrimination? We can connect it back to structural racism. And here we're talking about bias among institutions and across society. So we go from talking about a school or a school district to talking about the entire educational system. We go from talking about a particular hospital to talking about a healthcare system, and expanding beyond that to talking about healthcare. And we know that because of our history in the United States, because of our culture and our ideology and the way in which institutions have historically interacted with each other, we have these systems that were not designed to include many of us. And in this case, because we're focusing on race, we're not designed to include people of color. And we can point to everything from the need for the Voting Rights Act to what happened with our federal housing authority and loans, residential segregation, the GI Bill, which was responsible for propelling a lot of white families into the middle class by providing education and giving access to low interest loans. We are still living with the wealth gap that was created from that. So even though there were many Black soldiers, when they came back from the war, their benefits that they should have had access to were not available to them to move into the same kinds of neighborhoods that would have an appreciation of their value over time. and we are still living with that history. There's also the Social Security Act, who's included, right? Who has access to Social Security, what kinds of jobs do not even pay into the Social Security system, and things that were very specifically racialized, like the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there is so much history there. There are many broken treaties that we could talk about. There is a long and rich history in our country that routes back to land and labor, and the decisions that we have made and the stories that were told in order to justify that, and the ways that we are still living, right, with the stealing of that land and the stealing of people. So here's a moment to reflect. I want to encourage you to reflect on the time when you experienced privilege, reflect on a time when you experienced oppression. And I know it may be difficult to be that granular, but there may be something that immediately comes up for you. How were you impacted? How did you respond? Or what comes up for you when you think about the ways in which you hold these different identities? What strategies do you use currently to interrupt your own biases? Where are you still challenged? Are you able to have open conversations about race, racism, and other forms of bias with colleagues? How do you interrupt discrimination when it happens on your team or in your organization? And how do you recover when you get it wrong? I wanted to encourage you to take a few moments to jot down some notes for yourself and what you become aware of in your reflections. We're going to keep going. So as we make our way around the model, we are talking about teams and organizations at this point, and thinking about how you build awareness and you create the will to make change. This is where you assess and remedy inequitable behaviors, programs, policies, and practices. And you want to design and promote an inclusive and equitable culture. So what are the questions that you need to ask yourself? How will I design and align team structures and processes to value, empower, and develop the people in my organization? How will we better serve our clients, our customers, and the community? Many organizations talk about inclusion, and I would submit to you that what organizations are more likely to be practicing is assimilation. So when we think about what inclusion actually is, it is a space that allows people to belong even if they show up as themselves. So they are able to maintain their own unique identity and at the same time still belong. When we talk about assimilation, we're talking about hiding or covering your identity in order to belong. So having to feel like you aren't able to fully show up as yourself. And this is a disadvantage for organizations for a number of reasons. It's a disadvantage because you are missing out on fundamentally getting to know the people who are a part of your organization. It is also a missed opportunity because it requires a great deal of energy for people to constantly be in the space of trying to figure out how they can avoid seeming too anything, too much a person of color in terms of their identity. If they are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, feeling like they need to cover that. Or if they have a disability, feeling like they need to cover that. Or trying to be less feminine if you identify as a woman. So there are all kinds of dynamics that are playing out when people are covering up who they are, and you are missing out on the fullness of what they have to offer. So what do you want to think about as you are looking at your structures? You want to think about relationships with other people. How do you disaggregate data? Are you creating a culture of engagement? And how do you know? How are you answering that question? What do your systems look like? right? You want to think about policies around reimbursement and performance management. And are you doing salary studies on a regular basis? And are you cutting that data to look at different dimensions of diversity, to look at race, to look at gender, and whether or not you are paying people in a fair and equitable way? Looking at hiring and promotions and your different processes in the organization, dress code. Are you using inclusive meeting tools or practices? So, and I identify as an extrovert. So those of us who are extroverted are really good in most cases at getting our point across in meetings. And so often, three people speak and we leave a meeting and we say everyone agreed. And we're really missing out on the fact that there were many people in the room who did not speak or who didn't contribute in some other way. And so we have to slow down a little bit and rethink our processes. And then finally, in so many organizations, we have a pyramid structure where the people of color and sometimes even the women, depending on the organization, are concentrated at the bottom of the structure. And the higher up in the organization you go, the more white and male that structure becomes. So it's not enough to just say, oh, we have racial diversity or we have gender diversity. Where are people in the organizational structure? We want to think about ways that we can share power with others. I say the most powerful thing you can do is give power away and create opportunities for other people to share. So how do you create a flatter structure or have an approach where everyone can exercise their agency and make a contribution to the team or more broadly to the organization? And these are some of the practices that you can consider as you think about strategies for sharing power with the people that you work with. Finally, as we're rounding the bend, here at the societal level, again, we want to understand the cumulative and compounding effects of societal factors, right, that contribute to the isms. And we simultaneously, knowing the history, knowing the ways that we have gotten things wrong in the past, want to be dreaming into the future, holding a vision for what could be and what kind of world we actually want to create, one where people's gender and race and sexual identity, the amount of money that they have, the amount of education that they have, are not determining factors in whether or not they will be fully valued as a human being, right? And how do we do that? Well, absolutely, we need to understand our history, right? We need to hold that in our awareness, but we also need to know what our vision is for the future. Where is it that we want to see the world go? And how do we create little bits of that on a daily basis in the way that we move through the world? So, question for you is, what is your compelling vision for the future? And what steps will you take to move that vision forward as an equity competent leader? Here's my vision. This is my vision for the future: to work toward the elimination of racism and all forms of oppression, diminishing their ongoing impact by equipping, connecting, and partnering with people that have the will to do so. I want to live in a future where one's identity is not a predictor of their success or their failure, where all humans understand that they are a part of a larger universe and we behave as good stewards of the earth. I want to live in a future where even in conflict, we can find ways to see value and to respect each other's humanity. Reflection questions for you here. What is your organization practicing? Are you practicing inclusion, exclusion, assimilation, or differentiation? And how do you know? What does sharing power look like in your organization? What are some policies or practices that might need attention? How do you see the 4 levels playing out? And they play out not just around racism, which we've explored, but also around all of those different dimensions of diversity. And finally, What is your vision for a more equitable and inclusive future? So, how do you become more equity competent? Here are some places to start. I want to encourage you to grow your understanding of your own social identities. This is often a step that we want to create. We want to skip actually. We want to just jump into action, and we don't want to take the time to do the reflection that's required to really understand ourselves. I promise you, if you skip this step, you won't get very far along the path in the other areas of that structure. You want to begin to reflect on how your identity and how you move through the world have an impact on your behavior. I encourage you to engage critical friends. We all need those people in our life who will tell us the truth no matter what. I hope that you have some of those folks in your world. You want to accept that you have internalized beliefs that likely lead to biased actions, probably on a daily basis. And once we can accept our imperfection, then we can do something about it. I encourage you to explore the dimensions of diversity with which you're least familiar, but do not rely on people who hold those identities to do the work for you. There's so many resources that you can use to learn more about anything that you want to learn about, whether it's disability justice, whether it's the LGBTQ plus community, whether it is about the next generation. There's so much information out there. You want to disaggregate data by race and other dimensions of diversity, and you might be hesitant to do that, right? It can be tempting to say, well, I want to be inclusive, and being inclusive means that I should be colorblind and that I shouldn't be counting people in that way. But if we don't, then we can't pick up on the ways in which we might be continuing to perpetuate unfairness and disadvantaging those same people that we say we want to create more equity for. So we need to know what's happening so that we can address it. So I want you to look at and then remedy those policies and practices that are disadvantaging people who hold marginalized identities. I want you to get curious about who's missing. When you look at your team, when you look at your department, when you look at your organization, when you look at your faith community, who's not there? Not on your board, right? Who's not on your committee. And then finally, interrupt biased thinking and behaviors when they happen. So often we are sitting in a room and someone says or does something, and our chest tightens and our mouth gets dry and our heart is beating out of our chest, and we are deeply uncomfortable with what we see or what we heard, and we sit silent. We can no longer afford to be silent and continue to let injustice happen. You do not have to have the perfect words. You do not have to be clever or eloquent. Sometimes you simply need to make what is happening stop. And one way of doing that is just saying how uncomfortable you are with what's happening, right? Or you can ask a question, a clarifying question, and force that person to hear with their own ears again what it is that they said. So I deeply appreciate your time and your attention, and I wish you the best on your journey to becoming a more equity competent leadership, a more equity competent leader. We need your leadership in the world, and I look forward to answering your questions and talking with you. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Erica. I invite you to come online. There we go for our Q&A session. Folks, please put some questions in the chat or other comments that you'd like to share with Erica for her to respond to. I know everyone's asking about the slides.
I'm happy to share them.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll get those. We're going to have all of the recordings up, but then we'll also get PDFs of the slides for folks as well. So that's luckily an easy one to answer, I think. Erica, you mentioned so much or two about this self-awareness and that important part of the. If you could give some examples to help people, how do they become more self-aware around race, diversity, equity, and inclusion types of things?
Yeah, so one of the, it's different for everyone, but one of the resources I would recommend, I know for those of you who are readers out there, I'm a big fan of the book Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. She spends a lot of, it really requires you to do a lot of deep reflection and take a hard look at yourself. So that is one that I think about in particular. I see a question about self-assessment tools. Another resource, and this one is specifically focused on to what extent we are anti-racist. I highly recommend Dr. Deborah Plummer's. She has a anti-racist style indicator that's available on her website. It's dlplummer.com, and you can access that for free. And it tells you whether you are a under-functioning anti-racist, a functioning anti-racist, or a over-functioning anti-racist. So that's another resource that I would highly recommend.
Beautiful. Deborah Plum, I'll get her stuff in the chat there.
Awesome.
And look, Brenda has a question. I'm working with my board to have a more equitable pay scale for our employees. Is there any kind of resource that can help us in this process?
Specific to pay scale. There is a resource that comes to mind. I have to be honest and say it is, I know of someone who does work specifically around compensation, but their name is totally escaping me right now. One of the things you can do, of course, is to really take a look and disaggregate your data and then, see what are you noticing in terms of salaries based on race, salaries based on gender. Does that actually align with experience? The other thing that I would encourage people to think about are some of our practices for determining compensation in the first place, which may be where you're going here. So, for example, asking questions about past salary often continues to perpetuate inequities because people of color and women and others who have been marginalized are more likely to be paid less money in the first place. And so if their salary is being based off of what they made before, then that increases the possibility that you're just going to continue that cycle of underpaying people. And the other thing is negotiation. So more and more organizations are saying, we are going to set a fair and equitable wage for this role. And we are actually not going to, right? Because there's some cultural stuff around negotiation. There's some gender stuff around negotiation. And so starting to say, we're not actually going to negotiate salaries. This is the fair and equitable salary that we're offering. We're not going to do that game of the back and forth.
Thank you. I know Brenda's chiming in back in here too with around different roles and valuing different roles of pay in the agency. I don't know if there's anything that's coming to mind for you with that, but especially, how are we valuing essential kind of work that is not always compensated, but is the agency wouldn't function without it. Some of like those kind of roles. I think, is that what you're getting at, Brenda? And we'll see if, okay. Yes, okay.
We're having that moment right now, right? In the conversation about even paying people $15. And we have been saying to people, thank you so much for your service since March. And now we're arguing over whether or not they even deserve $15. So there's a absolute disconnect in terms of our lip service around what positions are valued and important in organizations and how we actually compensate people for doing that really important work.
Beautiful. There were some other questions in here back up from Fern asking about organizational change and starting with the personal, kind of like the focus around where to start. And maybe as people are in this process, maybe in their organization and in themselves and their own leadership, kind of those starting places for both, like starting with the self and organizational change, kind of how to help guide folks there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important there is ensuring that you are looking at systems, right? That you're looking at policies, that you are doing the data pieces in addition to learning that you might be doing. Because one of the things that again, I cannot emphasize how important the learning piece is. It's so important. But I find that people are starting to conflate talking about work around diversity, equity, and inclusion with actually doing it, right? So they're like, oh, we're doing this work and we're training and we're talking, like we're reading books and we're doing all of these other things, but nothing has fundamentally changed. Like you're not doing anything differently. And so I think it has to be about how are you doing your work differently.
And making those more systemic policy related changes. Naquana actually jumped in as you were saying that, asking about, it's pretty popular right now, sort of and Caitlin Curtis even talked about that, sort of like a tag or a fad, our DEI. And so kind of suggestions you have for these folks to be champions and to continue moving this work forward. Any advice for these folks?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So I can't tell you, or I can tell you actually, how the number of inquiries that I have gotten as a business owner has increased. I've been in this space for 20 years and I've been on my own full time for 3 years. And this past year, I mean, the uptick has been, we can't even keep up with it, to be honest. At this point, we're just like trying to, and there's no one to pass people off to, actually. So when I think about the people that I work with and trust, I usually have this list of like, we're not available, but here are these other people. But everyone right now is saying, we're not available either. And so it's this interesting moment. I even saw a data point that on LinkedIn, the DEI jobs have increased by 90% over the last year. Yes, the number of postings, it's bananas. And in many cases, to Naquana's point, it's very surface. And so you are like bringing people into into organizations, expecting them to work magic. One of my favorite pieces around this is a chief diversity officer will not fix your racist culture, right? No individual person, no matter how good they are on their own, is going to transform a culture. And everyone has to be involved. And I'll admit, as a, I don't know if I can call myself an activist at this point in my life, but as someone who has been in that space, of course I believe in grassroots work, right? And the people on the ground making significant change. But what I have found is that if the people at the highest levels in the organization are not committed, you're not going to see the kind of change that you're hoping for. And there is a disconnect, right, between what's being said and what's actually happening. And I think that we have been talking about this, not just for a year, but for many, many, many years. right? There's a great book for those of you again who are readers. Sorry, I'm like a walking library. And it's called Diversity Inc. and it's the failure of $1 billion industry. And what they're talking about is this disconnect between organizations saying that there is a commitment and actually not making any material change, right? Not seeing the numbers of people of color in leadership really shift, right? The way that we perhaps have seen more women in some spaces, that you can't quantify the work around race, unfortunately, in the same way that you can some of what's happened around gender. And by the way, that is not to say that we are where we should be around any of these things, right? Not around gender either. And obviously, when I say gender, we've done maybe more work for cisgender women, of course, than we have made space for people who don't identify in that way. So I think that organizations have to understand you cannot project manage your way out of this, right? You can't say, yeah, we're going to hit this hard for the next year and think that you can be done. It needs to be as fundamentally important as finance or marketing or any other, if you're a nonprofit, then it's, fund development or whatever. Like, it has to be a core part of the way that the organization does its work, and it has to be infused in all of those different areas if you want to see change.
Amen. And that speaks to Darlene put in the chat too about wondering if, when times get hard, if our DEI is going to be the first to go. It's like, well, we don't really need this. This was sort of a nice thing or project that we were doing on, but we'll kind of like put on the back burner. And that's a good concern. Monica is also asking, kind of jumping off the same theme here, is can you talk about what it means to have an inclusive leadership team? Some nonprofits continue to be led by white people while serving diverse and marginalized communities. How do organizations create a career and vocational pathways for BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is like that's like 4 questions, Monica. Okay. No, right.
That she's sort of Monica is in leadership too in another beautiful faith-based nonprofit, the National Benevolent Association, and that's also a pretty common theme in nonprofits in general, and including in faith-based ones where the leadership team is white. And you were talking about this in your presentation too, but sort of like, what are some other strategies or ways organizations can help change those?
Yeah.
Pathways.
So I think there has to be attention paid to, and I think there are sort of multiple questions in here. So when we talk about having an inclusive leadership team, I think we're both talking about what that team looks like, who's on it, right? And how is everyone on it valued? And we're also talking about how they work together. And right, how people work together effectively. And so doing this work, one of the things I have found in working with leadership teams is that sometimes there's stuff, right, with the leadership team that has nothing to do with DEI. It's just like history and stuff. When you start to do this work, all of that stuff is going to come out. So you absolutely sometimes says and exactly. Yes, and you have to work through that. You have to work through that other stuff. And there has to be a collective commitment that the mission, and this is where I think, having spent most of my career in the nonprofit space, and having an added layer in your cases of also, faith as a part of the institutional structure, that being able to lean on something that is bigger than yourselves, right? In terms of what is it from a mission perspective that you are actually there to do? And can we find a way, given that, right? Can we find a way, given that, to work together more effectively? And right, and to be able to work through that and to understand. And so going back to this idea, for example, of bringing someone in to do this work, the last time I was very involved in a search, I actually spent almost a year embedded on a leadership team before the person came in. And I spent a lot of time talking to them about this person is not going to be magic. And their job is actually to partner with all of you to help you understand how to fundamentally do your work in a different way so that you can help the people who work for you do their work in a different way, right? And there's no way that this person accomplishes the kind of cultural shift that you want to have on their own. They need each and every one of you to be fully invested in order to make that happen. And I think having those conversations really laid the groundwork, which leads to another piece, which is what are we bringing people into, right? As we're saying, we want more people of color. We want more people from the LGBTQ plus community. We want more women, or we like whatever it is that we're saying that we want. We want people with disabilities, right? How are we making a way for them to ensure that what they enter, right, is an inclusive environment and not just one where we're saying you are welcome if you can squeeze yourself into a box? And then finally, to think about that pipeline piece, I think we're going to have to get creative, right? So I think I spend a lot of time working in education, and anyone who knows education well knows that 80% of teachers are white women.
Yes.
And so there's always this like lamenting about that. Well, I'll tell you what, we have right at our fingertips in most schools, where people of color are. They are often the teacher assistants, right? Or the aides in the classroom. And so why aren't we finding ways for the people who want it? Some people may be perfectly happy in that role, but others may have aspirations or may have gone into that space. And I've heard this over and over because they want it to be teachers. And yet there are these barriers that have been in their way. Well, we don't have to go far, right? We don't have to go across the country trying to recruit people. How do we support the folks who are in our midst? How do we invest in the people who are right there, right? So for many of the organizations that are tied to Chisholm or are members they have STNAs, right? And
Right.
That is actually a job, fun fact, that I have done before. There's a long story, y'all. Life happens, right? So in between my starting college and finishing college, there was a lot of life that happened in there. And so I held that role, and I know what that work is like, and I know it is hard, and I know it is deeply meaningful. But people are not I mean, I think I made $6 and some, this was a few years ago, but I knew in my mind, I was like, oh, I gotta get back in school because I'm just trying to take care of myself. And this is hard for me financially. This is before I was a parent or anything. And so I'm watching these women mostly who are amazing humans, and they're raising families, and they're really challenged financially, right? And so thinking, how do we create a pipeline to nursing, right? Actually. Because people will tell you there's a pipeline from STNA to nursing to becoming an RN. And I find that that's not often true. And so looking at how do you actually start to do those kinds of things in order to help those things happen, instead of looking, here and there to find people who aren't connected to your organization and aren't necessarily invested in the way that maybe people who have already been there for a very long time would be invested.
That's, I think, a really helpful framework too. And just like increasing awareness from the leadership team. Darlene was also talking about in the chat here about like being able to coach and how true diversity is being able to listen to new views, and as well as coach and counsel people and kind of really develop that team, and noticing who is already with you and who's already invested in your organization and who's already there that kind of like looking over for one reason or another. And I think too, especially I hear over and over again from Chisholm folks that the people who work there are connected to that mission, right? And they are connected to like, I'm doing not only this job, but like just job in this space because I believe it is helping, I'm doing something good in the world, I'm doing God's work. And as your vision, as I also put in the chat that you were describing and inviting us to do, is that's the city of God. I mean, right? Like this equity and understanding of like the breaking down of barriers that so many of us are trying to do, and that your vision is bringing to life. Like that, to me, is what all of us are called to do.
Absolutely. I was going to add one other thing to that, which is the other thing around cultivating leadership is rethinking what leadership looks like. Right. So we have a very narrow perspective, right, about what a leader looks like, how a leader speaks, how a leader behaves. And we shroud things in this, oh, this is professionalism, right? But who set the standard around professionalism, and what are the ways that those things are just replicating, once again, dominant culture? And if you don't fit into that, then somehow you're not worthy. So we really have to, I challenge all of you to erase the conversation that you have after interviewing a candidate about fit, right? Oh, will they fit? Well, are you trying to get people to fit into what you have, or are you trying to create something different? Because if you're trying to create something different, then you want people who are going to add something to what you already have, not simply fit into what's already there.
I'm so glad. I'm noticing our time is wrapping up here, that you were saying that. I appreciated that so much in your slides and your presentation about assimilation, like naming that, because a lot of, I think, what happens too in organizational cultures is some things seem neutral when it's really dominant culture. And like it's not even in, not even in the consciousness to be thinking about it in that way. And especially when you're talking and bringing new people in, that sort of like, I think, lack of awareness really shows up a lot for folks.
Oh, so yeah, it's pervasive for sure.
I wonder too, if you could just speak briefly. I know I've talked to you about this in Chisholm's RDEI assessment on this point around kind of when a person of color like comes in, then they become the problem, or labeled as the problem person for speaking out, for like, we brought you in and we want you to be yourself and really tell us things. And we really don't. Could you speak to that for a minute or two?
Yeah, there's a fantastic model, and if any of you Google it, maybe somebody can link to it. I see Brian was dropping some resources into the chat. There's a model around what happens to women of color from an organization called COCO, that when they come into an organization, and it starts off as a honeymoon, right? Oh, we really want you here, come on in. And the first few weeks are great, and the organization will often say, we really want to increase our diversity, we really want more people of color, we really are so excited that you're here. And then once the honeymoon starts to kind of fade, and that person starts to experience microaggressions and other things, and they point that out and they say, here's what's happening to me, and they probably go to somebody they can trust, like HR, or they think they can trust HR or their manager. And then the next thing it's like, oh, well, we are a faith-based institution, or we are a nonprofit, we're a community organization. We would never do that, right? Because we think that discrimination always has to be direct and look cruel, and we don't always obvious, right? And we don't always understand how it can be more subtle, and how it can act itself out through policies in the organization as well, and how we view people and their behaviors and all kinds of other things. So there's so much work that we can do to really, again, examine what are we inviting people into. And we say that we're open, but then we get defensive. And so we really have to acknowledge that our good intentions may not always create the impact that we say that it is that we want to have. And what are we willing to do to remedy that?
That is a beautiful point to end on. And intent versus impact, y'all. That pay attention to that always. I want to thank Erica so much for presenting and being so engaging with us on this amazing topic. We're also grateful for the UCC Cornerstone Fund for sponsoring this session. Next on our schedule is our Affinity group meeting. So for more details about groups being offered, please look at the schedule. And following presentations and discussions from our Affinity groups, you can stay in those particular groups for our social time, which is being sponsored by Spencer Fain. So thank you, everyone. This was incredible, and what a gift. Thank you so much, Erica.
Thanks, everyone. God bless.
Thank you.